My neighbor's son borrowed my car for a date, then crashed it into my garage. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a neighborhood when someone crosses a line so blatant, so audacious that the air itself seems to hold its breath. For 3 years, I lived in quiet contentment on Maple Street. It was the kind of place where people waved from their porches and returned borrowed tools with a thank you note. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, not with a bang, but with the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal meeting brick. I stood on my front lawn, coffee mug still warm in my hand, watching my brand new sedan embed itself into the side of my own garage. The driver wasn't a stranger. He wasn't even an enemy. He was the 18-year-old son of the woman who had spent the last 6 months demanding access to my private driveway because hers was too far from her front door. And as I stared at the damage, she didn't look horrified. She looked annoyed. To understand why this incident felt less like an accident and more like a calculated siege, you have to understand the layout of our street and the peculiar geography of Brenda's ego. Maple Street is a cul-de-sac, lined with mature oak trees and houses that sit back just enough to offer privacy, but close enough to foster community. My house is number 42. Brenda lives at number 44. Our driveways are adjacent, separated by a modest strip of manicured hydrangeas and a low stone wall. My driveway is wide, paved with fresh asphalt, and leads directly to my detached 2-car garage. Brenda's driveway, however, is narrow, cracked, and slopes slightly upward, making it a tight squeeze for anything larger than a compact car. When I bought my house 3 years ago, I was thrilled. It was my first real investment, a sanctuary after years of renting apartments with thin walls and noisy neighbors. I spent months renovating the interior, painting walls, and upgrading the kitchen, but the exterior remained largely untouched until last year, when I finally saved enough to repave the driveway and install new garage doors. It was a point of pride for me. I kept it clean, swept it weekly, and treated it with the same care I gave my living room. Brenda moved in 6 months after my renovations were complete. She arrived with a moving truck that barely fit on her narrow driveway, forcing her to park partially on the grass verge. I remember helping her carry a few boxes up her steps, thinking she seemed pleasant enough, if a bit harried. She thanked me profusely, offering me a lukewarm bottle of water and a vague promise to return the favor someday. I didn't think much of it. Neighbors help neighbors. It's simple. The first sign of trouble came 2 weeks later. I was washing my car on a Saturday morning when Brenda walked over, holding a garden hose. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey there," she said, leaning against the stone wall. "I noticed your driveway is quite spacious. My son, Kevin, is getting his license soon, and he's going to need plenty of room to practice parallel parking and backing out. Since my spot is so cramped, do you mind if he uses your driveway for his lessons, just on weekends?" I paused, sponge in hand. It wasn't an unreasonable request on the surface, but something about the tone felt off. It wasn't a question, it was an expectation. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Brenda," I said politely. "My car is usually parked there, and I don't want any scratches or accidents. Maybe he could practice at the empty lot behind the school?" Her smile tightened. "Oh, come on, it's just concrete. What's the harm? We're neighbors. We should look out for each other." "I appreciate the sentiment," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "but I'd prefer to keep my property for my own use. I'm sure you understand." She didn't answer immediately. She just stared at me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly before turning on her heel and walking back to her house. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next few months, the requests escalated. First, it was asking to borrow my ladder because hers was too heavy. Then it was asking if she could store her recycling bins in my garage because hers were ugly and ruined her curb appeal. Each time, I politely declined, offering alternative solutions. Each time, Brenda's demeanor grew colder. She stopped waving. She started parking her car slightly over the property line, encroaching on the hydrangeas. When I mentioned it, she claimed the wind blew her car that way. Then came Kevin. He was 18, lanky, and possessed the confident swagger of someone who had never been told no. He started hanging around my driveway when I was home, kicking a soccer ball against my garage door. The thud-thud-thud was rhythmic and irritating. I asked him to stop. He shrugged and said, "It's just noise, man. Relax." The tension reached a boiling point last Tuesday. I had just returned from work, exhausted after a long day of meetings. I pulled into my driveway, careful to align my car perfectly within the lines. As I stepped out, I saw Brenda standing on her porch, arms crossed, watching me. Kevin was sitting on the hood of his beat-up sedan, scrolling through his phone. "Hey," Brenda called out. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the evening air. "We need to talk." I sighed, locking my car. "What's up, Brenda?" "Kevin has a date tonight," she said, as if this explained everything. "He needs to impress her. His car makes a weird rattling noise when he accelerates. It's embarrassing. You have that nice, quiet luxury car. He wants to borrow it for the evening, just for a few hours. He'll bring it back before midnight." I blinked, certain I had misheard. "You want me to lend my car to your son? For a date? It's not a big deal," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You're not using it tonight. You're just going to sit inside and watch TV. Kevin will be careful. He's a good driver. Brenda, I don't lend my car to anyone, I said, keeping my voice low but firm. It's my personal vehicle. Insurance doesn't cover unauthorized drivers. And frankly, I don't know Kevin well enough to trust him with my property. Her face flushed red. You're being selfish. We've been nothing but friendly to you. This is how neighbors treat each other. You're hoarding your resources while we're struggling. I'm not hoarding anything, I replied, feeling my patience wear thin. I'm setting boundaries. Please respect them. She scoffed, turning to Kevin. See, this is what we deal with. People who think they're better than everyone else. Kevin jumped off the hood of his car, glaring at me. Whatever. Your car looks old anyway. Probably wouldn't even start. It's brand new, I said, unlocking my front door. And it's staying right here. Good night, Brenda. Good night, Kevin. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I peeked through the blinds every 10 minutes. Brenda and Kevin were still outside, talking animatedly. At one point, Kevin pointed at my car. Brenda shook her head. Then they both went inside. I assumed the matter was dropped. I made dinner, watched a movie, and tried to forget the encounter. Around 9:30 p.m., I heard a car engine start. It wasn't the usual rumble of Kevin's old sedan. It was smoother, quieter. I frowned, glancing at the clock. Maybe they were leaving for the date. I didn't think much of it until I heard the distinct sound of my garage door opener clicking. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed to the window. The garage door was rising, and there, sitting in my driveway, was my car. But it wasn't parked. It was idling. And behind the wheel was Kevin. I threw open the front door, shouting, "Hey! What are you doing?" Kevin looked up, startled. He didn't stop the car. Instead, he grinned, a reckless, arrogant grin. "Relax, I'm just testing it out. Brenda said you wouldn't mind if I took it for a spin. She said you were just being dramatic." "I did not say that," I yelled, running down the steps. "Get out of my car!" He revved the engine, the sound echoing off the houses. "Chill out. I'll bring it back." Before I could reach the driveway, he slammed the car into reverse. But he didn't check his blind spot. He didn't look behind him. He just floored it. The tires squealed, smoking against the asphalt. The car lurched backward, veering sharply to the left, directly toward my garage wall. "No!" I screamed. The impact was deafening. Metal crunched. Glass shattered. The car shuddered and stopped, half buried in the brickwork of my garage. Dust billowed into the night air. I stood frozen, my hands trembling, staring at the wreckage of my pride and joy. The driver's side door opened. Kevin stumbled out, looking pale but unharmed. Behind him, Brenda appeared on her porch, holding a cup of tea. She didn't rush over. She didn't call for help. She just took a sip, looked at the damage, and sighed. "Well," she said, loud enough for me to hear, "that's unfortunate. But since you refused to let him use the driveway properly, I suppose this is what happens when people are uncooperative." The hissing of the ruptured radiator was the only sound in the neighborhood. Plumes of white steam billowed from the crumpled hood of my car, mixing with the acrid stench of burnt rubber and deployed airbag powder. I stood at the edge of my driveway, my bare feet cold against the asphalt, staring at the front end of my sedan. It was wedged so deeply into the brick facade of my garage that the front wheels were actually elevated, spinning lazily in the empty air. Kevin was leaning against his own car, rubbing his chest and coughing. He looked shaken, the arrogant swagger entirely evaporated. But Brenda was the one who spoke first. She walked down her driveway, her slippers scuffing against the concrete, and stopped a few feet from me. She didn't look at her son. She didn't look at the destroyed garage. She looked at me, her expression a mask of profound disappointment. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "I suppose you're going to make a big deal out of this." I turned to her, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of her statement. "Make a big deal out of it? Brenda, your son stole my keys, crashed my car, and demolished the wall of my garage. What exactly do you think I should do? Bake him cookies?" She rolled her eyes, a dramatic, full-body gesture. "Don't be so hyperbolic. He was just moving the car to a safer spot because you left it in an unsafe position. He lost control. It happens. You need to calm down before you say something you regret." I walked over to my car and peered through the shattered driver's side window. The keys were still in the ignition. I reached in, rolled down the broken window frame, and pulled them out. "I locked my doors, Brenda. He had to break the window to get in. Look at the glass on the ground." She waved a hand dismissively. "Details. The point is, Kevin is clearly traumatized. The airbag went off in his face. He's going to have whiplash. You should be checking on him, not yelling about bricks." I didn't argue with her. Arguing with Brenda was like trying to nail jelly to a tree. It just made a mess and achieved nothing. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. While I waited for dispatch, I took photos. I photographed the broken window, the keys in the ignition, the tire marks leading backward, and the massive crater in my garage wall. I made sure to capture Brenda standing in the background, looking entirely unconcerned. When the officer arrived, Brenda immediately shifted her strategy. She fluttered over to him, her voice dropping an octave into what she clearly thought was a tone of vulnerable distress. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she said, placing a hand on her chest. My son was just trying to help our neighbor here. He noticed the car was parked too close to the street and tried to move it into the garage for safekeeping. But the garage is just so narrow and the lighting is terrible, and he had a minor medical episode at the wheel. We're just so worried about him. The officer looked at her, then at me, then at the car embedded in the masonry. A minor medical episode? Did you call an ambulance, ma'am? No, he's fine now, she said quickly, but he's in shock. The officer pulled out his notepad. Sir, what's your version of events? I handed him my phone, showing him the time-stamped photos. I was inside my house. My neighbor's son broke my window, took my keys, and reversed into my garage at full speed. I have the security camera on my porch. It caught the whole thing. The officer's demeanor changed instantly. The polite, neutral mask slipped, replaced by the weary annoyance of a man who deals with entitled people every day. He walked over to Kevin, who was still pretending to nurse his chest. Son, did you break into this vehicle and drive it without the owner's permission? The officer asked, his voice flat. Kevin looked at his mother, panicked. Brenda stepped in front of him. He had implied consent. We're neighbors. We share everything. Ma'am, step aside, the officer said, his voice hardening. Unless you have a written authorization from the owner, taking a vehicle without permission is unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, and breaking the window makes it burglary of a conveyance. The color drained from Brenda's face. Burglary? That's a felony. You can't arrest him for moving a car. He's going to college in the fall. He shouldn't have broken the window, the officer replied calmly, pulling out his radio to call for a backup unit to handle the processing. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of flashing lights and official forms. The tow truck driver took one look at my car and shook his head. The frame was bent, the engine block cracked, and the front axle destroyed. It was a total loss. He then noted the structural header above the garage door was compromised, requiring a complete rebuild. As the driver was hooking up my car, Brenda was on her phone, loudly complaining to her husband about how the police were harassing us and how my insurance was going to be a nightmare. She was treating the situation not as a disaster, but as a profound personal inconvenience. When the backup officer arrived to take Kevin's statement, Brenda tried to intercept him. Officer, you need to understand. This whole situation is highly stressful for Kevin. The airbag deployment was excessive. I want you to note in your report that the neighbor's car had a defective safety system that caused my son physical harm. The officer just stared at her. Ma'am, the airbag deployed because he crashed the car at 30 miles per hour into a brick wall. That's how they work. Well, it shouldn't have hit him in the face, she huffed. I expect the neighbor to cover his medical bills for the bruising, I finally snapped. Brenda, if you don't get off my property right now, I'm having you trespassed right alongside him, she gasped, clutching her pearls. You can't trespass me? I live next door! I have rights. You have the right to leave, I said, pointing to the sidewalk. Now. She glared at me, a look of pure venom, before turning and marching back to her house. Kevin was escorted to the back of the cruiser, looking like a deflated balloon. I spent the night in a hotel, unable to sleep with a massive hole in the garage and the smell of antifreeze seeping through the drywall. I lay awake, mentally calculating the deductibles and the months of repairs. My car was gone, my sanctuary breached, and the people responsible were sleeping 50 feet away. The next morning, I drove my rental car back to the house to meet the insurance adjuster. The daylight made the damage look even worse. The garage door was hanging by a single track, and the bricks were scattered across the lawn like oversized teeth. The adjuster, a meticulous woman named Sarah, took her measurements, clicked her pen, and gave me a sympathetic look. She confirmed it was a total loss on the vehicle and that the property damage claim would be substantial. The only issue, Sarah said, lowering her clipboard, is that the at-fault driver is a young adult with no assets, and his mother is already calling my office claiming comparative negligence. She's arguing that your garage was built too close to the property line and contributed to the accident. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. My garage was built 10 years before she moved in. It's exactly where it was when the house was constructed. I know, Sarah sighed, but she's hired a lawyer, and they're filing a countersuit. They're claiming your property encroaches on their air rights and caused a psychological hazard to the driver. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache blooming behind my eyes. It was absurd. It was completely, utterly baseless. But I knew people like Brenda. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about winning. They would drain my savings and tie me up in court for years just to prove a point. I'll need to speak to my attorney, I told Sarah. Definitely, she said. And you might want to check your security footage. She's claiming you verbally authorized him to move the car. After Sarah left, I went inside to pull the memory card from my porch camera. I needed to prove I was inside the whole time. I plugged it into my laptop and scrubbed through the footage from the night before. I watched Kevin break the window, get in, and reverse into the garage. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. 10 minutes before Kevin broke into my car, the camera caught Brenda walking up my driveway. She wasn't just standing on her porch. She walked right up to my car, tried the handle, and then leaned in close to the driver's side window. She held something in her hand, a small metallic object. She wedged it into the window frame, manipulated it for a few seconds, and then walked back home. She hadn't just told him to take the car. She had picked the lock, or at least unlocked it for him, to make it look like I had left it accessible. And then I heard a heavy knock at my front door. I looked out the peephole. It was Brenda holding a thick manila envelope, smiling a cold, triumphant smile. I opened the front door, the morning sun casting long shadows across the porch. Brenda stood on the welcome mat, holding out the thick manila envelope. She wore a smug, tight-lipped smile, the kind reserved for people who believe they have just checkmated their opponent. "Morning," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I thought you should receive this directly. Consider it a courtesy." I took the envelope. It was heavy, the paper crisp and expensive. "What is this, Brenda?" "It's a formal notice of intent to sue," she replied, crossing her arms. "My lawyer drafted it last night. Since you refused to cooperate and help Kevin with his medical and vehicular expenses, we're taking the matter to civil court. We're also filing an injunction against your garage. It's an unpermitted structure that encroaches on our visual easement. It's an eyesore, and it caused this entire accident." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch. I didn't raise my voice or argue. I just felt a profound sense of clarity. She was entirely detached from reality. "You're suing me for $50,000. I read from the summary page, keeping my tone conversational, "for emotional distress, property damage to Kevin's vehicle, and medical bills. And you're claiming my garage, which has stood here for a decade, is an unpermitted eyesore. $50,000 is just the initial demand," she said, lifting her chin. "Once the judge sees the bias you've shown, the damages will increase. You should have just let him use the car." I pulled my phone from my pocket. "Brenda, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not going to argue with you, but I need you to understand exactly what happens next." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, spare me the threats." "It's not a threat. It's a timeline," I said. I tapped the screen and dialed my attorney, David. I put it on speaker and held it up. "David," I said when he answered. "I have Brenda from next door on the porch. She just handed me a lawsuit demanding $50,000 for the crash last night. She's also claiming my garage is an unpermitted structure." David's voice was calm and professional. "Good morning, Brenda. I'm David, the homeowner's legal counsel. I assume you're referring to the incident where your son broke the window of my client's vehicle, stole the keys, and reversed into the garage?" Brenda's smile faltered. "He didn't steal it. He had implied consent, and he was injured by a defective airbag. Actually," David continued, "my client has high-definition security footage. It clearly shows your son breaking the glass. More importantly, it shows you approaching the vehicle 10 minutes prior and using a tool to unlock the door. That makes you an accessory to breaking and entering." The color completely drained from Brenda's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a rapid, dawning panic. That's a lie," she stammered. "You edited it. The footage is time-stamped and stored on a cloud server," David said smoothly. "I will be forwarding the unedited video file to the police detective handling the criminal report, as well as to your attorney. Furthermore, my client will be filing a countersuit for the total loss of the vehicle, the structural repairs, and the legal fees incurred by this frivolous lawsuit. I strongly advise you to withdraw this notice immediately." I ended the call. The silence on the porch was absolute. The only sound was the distant hum of a lawnmower 2 streets over. "You can't do that," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling. "You're trying to ruin my son's life over a stupid car." "Your son ruined his own life when he decided to steal my car," I replied quietly, "and you ruined yours when you decided to pick the lock. Have a good day, Brenda." I turned and walked back inside, closing the door firmly behind me. I didn't look through the peephole, but I could hear her frantic pacing on the porch, followed by the sound of her hurrying back to her house. The fallout was swift. By noon, Mark, Brenda's husband, knocked on my door. He looked exhausted, holding a bottle of wine and a handwritten apology. He explained he had watched the video David sent him and was mortified. He had no idea she had picked the lock, and he was immediately withdrawing the lawsuit. He also handed me a check for $10,000 to cover the immediate out-of-pocket expenses for the garage cleanup. "I'm so sorry," Mark said, his voice thick with embarrassment. "I work long hours. I didn't realize how far she had taken this neighbor feud. I'm handling it from here." I accepted the apology and the check. I didn't want to punish Mark. He was just a guy trying to manage a household with someone who lacked basic empathy. The criminal charges, however, remained. The district attorney reviewed the footage. Kevin was charged with burglary of a conveyance and grand theft auto. Because it was a first offense, his lawyer negotiated a deferred prosecution agreement. He had to pay full restitution, complete 300 hours of community service, and attend a mandatory rehabilitation program. If he stayed out of trouble for 2 years, the charges would be expunged, but his record would show the arrest, and his college financial aid was in jeopardy. Brenda faced a different consequence. She was charged with accessory to breaking and entering. Her lawyer reduced the charge to a misdemeanor, but she still paid heavy fines and served probation. The legal fees decimated their savings. A month later, a for sale sign appeared on their lawn. Mark told me the stress of the lawsuit and the neighborhood's quiet ostracization had become too much. They were moving to start over. On the day the moving truck arrived, I stood on my newly rebuilt porch. The garage wall was fresh brick, the mortar still curing, smelling of dust and fresh paint. Brenda walked past my house carrying a box of light fixtures. She didn't look at me. She didn't glare. She just kept her eyes fixed on the pavement, her shoulders hunched against the weight of her own consequences. I watched the truck pull away, taking the toxicity with it. The neighborhood felt lighter, the air clearer. I walked over to my pristine driveway, swept a stray leaf off the asphalt, and went inside to make a cup of coffee. The silence that fell over Maple Street wasn't the heavy, breathless silence of a crossed boundary. It was the peaceful, quiet hum of a place where people finally respected each other's property, their privacy, and the simple rule that you don't steal your neighbor's car.